Hi, everyone, and welcome to Accelerating Flow, an introduction to Team Topologies in practice. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you all if you're here live. I'd also like to welcome you if you are watching the recorded version. If you're live, you can submit questions, so I would encourage you to do so. I've built in some time to answer any questions, so if you submit them, I will see them coming in, and I will answer them as soon as I get a break in my reading. To introduce myself, my name is Christopher Marsh. I'm an independent consultant. I am working a lot with Conflux at the moment to introduce team topologies and approaches for fast flow or value delivery in the US market. I was at a party not too long ago, and I was with a group of people I hadn't met before, and somebody asked the icebreaker question, what's the high point of your life? And as I was reflecting on this, I realized I don't really have the mental model of high points or low points really in my life. I think about inflection points. One of the common characteristics of inflection points in my life is it has driven me forward in some respect. It's amplified a skill or an ability. It's accelerated me in some direction, but it's also brought joy to me. And I was thinking about what the inflection points have been in my life professionally. There have been many of them. And you'll see here some of them, design patterns. I remember discovering design patterns, reading the Gang of Four book. Unit testing was another one. I found great joy in that, as well as it accelerating my ability to deliver valuable software with the companies and organizations I was working with. TDD, a light bulb went off in my head with that. DDD as well, object-oriented programming earlier on, continuous integration, ensuring that all the code from all of the team was getting integrated early, again, accelerating the whole team's time to value. Continuous delivery, building on that. And then team topologies. Conway's law is in there as well. I'm going to spend a moment on Conway's law. So for any of you that haven't heard of Conway's law before, Mel Conway, in a publication, he coined the quote, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I'm sure some of you will have experienced this, but if you are in a monolithic team, a large team, and you are trying to produce a microservice architecture, then often what you have is tight coupling. You struggle to decouple your components, your services, and everything kind of gloms together. Likewise, if you have a distributed team working on a monolithic application, the tendency is for components to emerge for these different teams to work on. So what is Team Topologies? Well, Team Topologies is a book written by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais. It's published in 2019. Now, I go back a long way with Matthew. I think 18 years ago, I started working with Matthew. And I can remember late nights working with him on a large financial institution, wrangling lots of code branches that then needed integrating at a later date. What could possibly go wrong, right? And the reason Team Topologies looms large for me as an inflection point is all of the others were these kind of independent things. And yes, they were linked. They were linked together. Sometimes I took a path towards one. Sometimes I, didn't focus so much on that in the future, and I went on my journey. So one of the things about Team Topologies, one of the reasons that it was really kind of the mother of all inflection points is it kind of encompassed everything that I've been working towards in my professional career. It encompassed all of those things that I was talking about, but not in a super opinionated way. It was a way for me to visualize how to bring it all together, not only at a team level, but also at an organizational level and a technical level. So let's dig in a bit to what Team Topologies is. Team Topologies, it is a framework. You can consider it a framework. I'm tentative in using that word because often frameworks are seen as constraining and dogmatic, and I'm sure some of you will have worked with these frameworks. Things like Scrum, things like SAFe, they prescribe the way that you should do things. They have hard boundaries that you must not cross. And that's where the dogma comes from. And I'm not anti-framework. I think there's a lot of good stuff you can get out of these frameworks. I think they can definitely drive value. They're also not orthogonal to Team Topologies. It's not necessarily one thing or the other. But what I would advise is looking at these frameworks, seeing what characteristics, what behaviors, what structures, what processes, where is the value being driven and where is friction being created? So taking the things that you find are delivering value and then removing the other things rather than sticking dogmatically to the framework. So Team Topologies, I think of it as a toolbox. It's a library of patterns and practices that you can apply in order to build systems and architectures, organizations that are going to drive value for you, and they're going to accelerate fast flow, not only for engineers, but the entire organization. And so there are 6 essential patterns. The first is team types, and there are 4 patterns for team types. So the first pattern is a stream-aligned team. The stream-aligned team has responsibility for the value stream all the way from idea through to a production application that's in front of your customers, and then operating that in production. There's no handoff for a stream-aligned team. The stream-aligned team is cross-functional. There's no handoff between product and engineering. There's no handoff between engineering and QA. There's no handoff between QA and DevOps or security. And there's no handoff to operational folks to support it afterwards. The stream-aligned team owns that value stream. So that is start to finish. It's comprised of cross-functional individuals. And it's a good idea to think in terms of the capabilities required for that team rather than the roles. The reason for this is when you have this team, it will be long-lived and they will be focused on producing value. You need to get away from this idea of resources, people who have individual talents within a silo. Because what I found is the most highly functional individuals, the people that generate the most value themselves, they don't necessarily fit into a silo. They can do front end, they can do back end, they can do QA, they can do DevOps. And in fact, they really want to. They want to be supported in this. Now, are they experts in all of these things? No, you don't want a team of generalists, but you do want people where there is an intersection between skills so that as a group, they have the autonomy to figure out how to manage the work that they're doing and how to achieve value through that. The second team type is a platform grouping. Now, if you've read the book, it's referred to as a platform team, but for reasons I'll go into a little bit later, it's actually easier in terms of the mental model to think about it as a platform grouping rather than a platform team. The platform team still has end-to-end responsibility for that platform. So again, they come up with the ideas, they produce those ideas, they release them, and then they manage them. So again, no handoffs at all within that team. However, the purpose of a platform grouping is to accelerate the folks on the stream-aligned team. It is to provide services that accelerate that value delivery, that value creation from stream-aligned teams. So it's fully internal. The third type of team is enabling team. So the enabling team is there. It's a central hub of a certain type of knowledge, expertise. It could be technical, it could be domain, it could be finance, it could be compliance, or it could be a specific type of technology. If you have stream-aligned teams that are wholly autonomous, then there is a risk that knowledge becomes localized, that people are doing things that in a way that the organization as a whole has already experimented with, and there are better ways to do it. Now, the stream-aligned team does have autonomy, so they do not need to do their things the same way that the rest of the organization, but the enabling team, again, can accelerate them by disseminating knowledge and by coaching them in good ways to go. The complicated subsystem team is for something where there is specific knowledge, often technical. So for example, if there is a mainframe somewhere, that probably won't be knowledge, ability, expertise, experience that exists throughout the organization. So that complicated subsystem team will own that. And then they can work with the other teams to make sure that the enabling teams understand enough to advise the stream-aligned teams, and the platform groupings can provide those services that accelerate time to value for the stream-aligned teams. So those are the 4 teams, and I'm going to focus mostly on the top 3 for this talk. Second patterns in the toolbox are the interaction modes. So again, I'm sure you've all been in organizations where the communication pattern is fairly chaotic. To get things done, you need large quantities of people in many meetings, lots of voices to be heard, lots of opinions, lots of tight coupling between the teams. And in fact, sometimes the team boundaries can even not be clear. So what we have here is we have 3 patterns. This is an intentional way to understand how your teams should be communicating with each other, to define that and then be able to monitor it and figure out when that interaction mode needs to change. These are not tightly coupled to the team types. Everything changes, everything evolves. And what you will find is as the teams start to move into their roles, as they start to gain expertise and work together, the communication mode, the interaction mode will need to change. So collaborative mode. That's what I was talking about before. That is when you have a very tight coupling in terms of communication between 2 teams. There will be lots of day-to-day communication, probably more people involved in those sessions for communication. And that typically happens when you've just established a new platform team or you're thinking about it. The collaborative effort should be, or the collaborative interaction mode should be short-lived. This should not go on for a long time. Its purpose is to establish shared understanding of what the two teams are doing in order to swiftly move to the next interaction model, which is X as a service. So X as a service model means that those communication modes have been firmly established. We're probably looking at APIs now being provided. They're easy to use. They're easy to understand. They provide the value that the consuming team needs. And so that communication pattern follows that. Now, X as a service communication mode or interaction mode, this is not something you design up front. As you identify new opportunities to produce new platforms, you don't design that. You don't say, like you would with an API, this is the way it is going to operate. And in fact, when we're talking about APIs, when we do try and design APIs up front, we can often find that they don't actually deliver the value to the consuming team that we envisaged at the outset. So that collaborative pattern, that collaborative interaction mode, that means that we can get the information that we need in order to make sure that the APIs are functional and the X as a service communication model is also functional. Facilitating is the final interaction mode. Now, facilitating is interesting because these folks, the folks who are communicating in a facilitating way, they are not doing work for the team that they are communicating with. They are not a SWAT team that swoops in with some expertise, does the work for the streamline team or the platform team, and then disappears again. The facilitating mode is there to mentor, to grow skills and capabilities within another team. So the facilitating mode is often used with enabling teams. So for example, if you had a DevOps enabling team, then they may use the facilitating interaction mode in order to help streamline teams grow the DevOps capabilities that they need within their team. Facilitating is often fairly short-lived as well, because the goal is to support other teams, platform teams, streamline teams in becoming autonomous. So if we start to see that facilitating mode going on for a long time, then it's usually a good indicator that we need to be looking at how that communication is happening and looking at how much of the capabilities that need to be grown within the streamlined or the platform team is actually happening. So that's something certainly to keep an eye on. When we introduce these concepts to customers, it's usually the enabling team in facilitating mode that is the most difficult concept to grasp. I had a conversation with a customer recently, and they said, yeah, we get it. So we spun up this enabling team, and what they're going to do is they have this expertise. The streamlined teams are going to be able to grab them. They're going to swoop in. They're going to do all the work. It's going to make us much more efficient. So I said, that's pretty interesting. Let's talk about what's happening here. So they said, yeah, we have 7 teams. They're all trying to do the same thing. So it's going to be far more efficient if the enabling team comes in and they actually do the work for them. And I asked, is it the same problem they're solving? And the answer was yes. Super interesting. Because in that case, what I did was I steered them towards a platform team. What you're looking at here is a really prime opportunity to actually spin up a platform team, work in a collaborative way with all 7 of the streamlined teams to start with to ensure that they're producing something that is valuable and easy to consume, but it's not an enabling team. So sometimes what we find is the concepts land, but these principles that we have here, the team types and the interaction modes, these are things that need reinforcing, and that people don't always get it wrong. What they're doing is they're applying the wrong terminology. So one of the reasons that these patterns are so useful is to establish that shared vocabulary, that shared understanding, so that we can make sure that we are supporting fast flow. Next, we'll move on to cognitive load theory. And I would say if there is one single thing that you take away from this session right now, it would be cognitive load theory. So in cognitive load theory, there are 3 types of cognitive load. So we take the case that every individual and every team has a maximum cognitive load capacity. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that what we're doing is we're optimizing for the right type of cognitive load. So the first type of cognitive load is extraneous. Extraneous cognitive load is often around processes. It's around the effort required to maintain a mental model of something potentially complex. It's how we teach things. We can teach things in a way that is easy for people to understand and absorb. We can also teach things in a really abstract way that makes it very difficult for people to understand how to do things. Extraneous cognitive load, we can change that. So if we take the case of a release approval process, and I'm drawing from personal experience here, that requires that you submit a form to a nebulous body out there somewhere within the organization, you have to then fill out another form, and that goes to another body. You then have to find an ID for a specific future release, and you have to attach that to your request for a deployment. And at this point, we're talking to a QA or a staging environment. However, you don't have access to the document that relates the IDs to the future production release. If you have all these stars in alignment, you can then go to a meeting, and it runs for 90 minutes every day, and your forms will have been received and a spreadsheet will have been compiled, and you need to sit in the meeting for 90 minutes until your name is called, at which point you will be told whether or not you are approved to deploy to QA. At that point, if you got the ID wrong, you're told to get the right ID and come back the next day. This is clearly tedious, tortuous, very difficult to hold that mental model in your head. That can be changed. That can be changed because you can redesign the process. There is nothing intrinsic about the activity, the exercise of releasing software that needs that level of complexity. I'm seeing a question here, so I'm just bring that up on the screen. So how do you deal with organizations who get hung up on what do they actually deliver for enabling teams working in a facilitating mode? That is a great question. And I think it is not easy to answer. What do they actually deliver speaks to an organization that's looking for utilization numbers. They're looking for productivity metrics. And what we do is we try to move organizations away from this idea of productivity and toward value. So once we can identify how you actually create value for the organization, you backtrack from that and you produce the metrics around that value that go back down from the commercial, the financial requirements of the business objectives and requirements, and map that back down to what the product engineerings are actually delivering or providing. So it's probably a 90-minute conversation in itself, how you do that, but it has to change at a cultural level. If the organization is actually hung up on these productivity metrics, on utilization metrics, those kind of things, you're not going to be able to get to enabling teams working in a facilitating mode. So it has to happen culturally, and it has to get buy-in from leadership. So back to cognitive load, intrinsic cognitive load cannot be changed. So this is based on experience often. This is learned things. So a good example is Java. You can't change the complexity of Java. It is what it is. So in order to optimize for intrinsic cognitive load, there are two things that you can do. So the first thing that you can do is you can ensure that you hire people with the minimum level of experience and expertise in these kind of technologies, whatever technologies you're using, so that they can actually start working. The second thing you can do is you can provide support for professional development within the organization. Make sure that there is an understanding within the organization that although this, yes, it's an investment, it's not a cost center, because that investment in upskilling your people, that then comes back because it allows them to operate more effectively. So then we get to germane cognitive load. This is where you want to be focusing your time. Germane cognitive load is where all the good stuff happens. This is where all the domain knowledge lives. This is where the creativity lives. So if we take the case that there is a cap on your cognitive load capacity, then we need to minimize extraneous as much as possible, shrink intrinsic as much as we can, and leave the remainder of that cognitive load capacity for germane. Once we get to a place where individuals on the teams and the teams themselves are spending most of their cognitive load capacity on germane cognitive load, this is a really, really great place to be. The remaining patterns that we have here, the first is thinnest viable platform. We're all aware of minimum viable products, the concept there, and it's the same concept for a platform. You don't have to do a big design up front. We should take the same approach to platform development as we do to minimum viable products. Let's look at where the value is. Let's start small. Let's experiment. A thinnest viable platform actually can be nothing more than a wiki page. You can start with a wiki page. That's the experiment. Here is a bunch of standards. Here is a bunch of patterns for doing things, specific things within the organization that happen often. That can be your first platform. So there are other characteristics of a platform, which I'll get into a little bit later. So it can't be just a wiki page, but this can be a really good start. Now, if you track the usage of the wiki page, that then gives you valuable data that you can use to figure out as you produce something that's actually a software platform, a system, where do you start there? What is the most popular advice or standards or patterns that you are putting on your wiki page. And let's start there because you know that these are the most valuable. Next thing is flexible team boundaries. So this does not mean permeable team boundaries. Teams should have firm boundaries. It should be clear who is on the team and who is not on the team. That should be absolutely clear. However, things change. And so as things change, you don't want to get locked into the mentality that, well, we scoped out this team as 8 individuals. Now it needs to drop to 7. What do we do? We've got 8. No, you can plan this through. You can change that team boundary. You can shrink it, or you can grow it. And again, if you're finding that you need more capacity or you need more expertise in a certain direction, you can bring another person into that team. And the final thing is continuous adaptation. So this is not a one and done. If you are looking for the way to essentially reorganize your entire organization, just draw some boxes on a page, put names in them, and then you're done and move forward. Team Topologies is not the optimal approach for this. And there are other frameworks that you can use. That doesn't mean you can't come back to Team Topologies later once you've established this, but Team Topologies is all about continuous adaptation. So you need to grow this muscle of continuous adaptation into your teams. Now, I'll touch on that a little bit more. Continuous improvement is what you're striving for at a cultural and an organizational level. And I hear the word transformation. Companies are looking for a transformation. The only constant is change. And the problem that I have with transformation is the canonical example of the butterfly. So the butterfly starts off as a caterpillar. It then enters its chrysalis. It then emerges as a beautiful butterfly. Perfect example of transformation. But what nobody talks about is what happens after that. So the butterfly enjoys life until 2 weeks later, it dies. And I think this analogy continues forward to so many organizations I've worked with where they go through a transformation process, but then fail to adopt that culture of continuous improvement and either get left behind or things get tweaked in an unintentional manner. And actually the whole thing fails to yield the value that was expected up front. So let's get more into team topologies. So I've talked about the stream-aligned teams. So they have the ownership of a certain value stream. And that ownership goes from idea all the way through to value to the consumer and operating the systems that provide that value ongoing. So anytime you see a team topologies diagram, the flow of value is left to right. So you'll see in this diagram here, we have 2 stream-aligned teams. They are represented by these yellow rectangles with rounded corners and a slightly darker yellow border. So any diagram you will see, any stream-aligned team goes the entire width of that diagram, the flow of value being from left to right. On the right-hand side, if you ever see a team topologies diagram where there is a handoff, where there is an X as a service coming from a stream-aligned team to another stream-aligned team or a platform team, any kind of team, that is an anti-pattern that would need to be addressed. Teams never communicate with other teams, streamlined or not, with the X as a service interaction mode. They never hand off to other teams. If they do, it is not a stream-aligned team, and that needs to be addressed at the organizational level, possibly even at the architectural level as well. So then we see we've got an enabling team on the right. Enabling teams are represented by kind of pink boxes, rounded corners, rectangles with a slightly darker border as well. And just as a reminder, the enabling team, they often work in a facilitating way. So they're actually working with the other teams. They can sit anywhere in the diagram. Then at the bottom, we have platform grouping. So that is a blue rectangle with a slightly darker border with sharp corners. And then we have the complicated subsystem team. So we can see that's orange and it's got a slightly darker border as well. And again, platform groupings, complicated subsystem teams, like enabling teams, they can exist in different parts of this diagram. Now let's look at the communication or the interaction modes. So we have X as a service. You'll see those going from platform groupings through to stream-aligned teams. Now, if you look at the left hand 2 X as interaction modes, you'll see that the middle one there, the one second from the left, that reaches over the bottom stream-aligned team and up to the top stream-aligned team. So that means it is not communicating directly with the stream-aligned team below. It's bypassing that, it's stepping over that. So that's a convention that we have to make sure that within your diagram, it's clear which teams are communicating with each other. So that's one way to do it. You could have those two. So to represent a platform grouping that is communicating with both streamlined teams, you could have two of the triangular X as a service interaction modes. We do have a shorthand for that because that can get a little busy. So the shorthand for that is to place an asterisk on any streamlined team or any other team, which is also being communicated with. So that right-hand X as a service interaction mode, that's basically telling us that that's shorthand that it is communicating with both streamlined teams. So the collaboration interaction mode, we can see there that the platform grouping is collaborating with the complicated subsystem team. So this may be because the complicated subsystem team is providing something to the platform grouping and they're having that tight collaboration to start with. It may be slightly longer in this. It depends what exactly is happening between those two teams, what they're trying to achieve. But we can see there that they are in collaboration mode. So we can anticipate that there is lots of communication going on and they're communicating a lot. Final interaction mode in terms of the modeling shapes is the facilitating, and that's represented by that kind of green circle. You will also note that the interaction mode shapes are slightly transparent. They're semi-transparent. And that's so that you can see what's going on underneath. Nothing's blocking anything out. So this works really well in digital formats. You also, once you get into interaction modeling, you wouldn't need to put X as a service, facilitating collaboration. You wouldn't need to explicitly state those within those shapes. You would know that's what they mean, but I put them in here because I'm introducing the concepts. Likewise, you wouldn't literally type streamline team for each of these. You would name them as to which team they are. Platform grouping, again, you would do the same thing. So it would be much more descriptive. And in fact, if you use Miro or other tools, you can actually download these shapes. You can get them from shapes.teamtopologies.com. So you can immediately start creating your own digital modeling within whatever tool that you use. So let's go back to a traditional socio-technical view. And in fact, if you look at the previous diagram, you can see there are aspects that sort of look a little familiar. It looks stacked. You've got the streamline teams stacked at the top. You've got the platform grouping at the bottom. What many of us have is this mental model of the socio-technical view, which is a stacked either architecture or organization. And I think one of the reasons these are so prevalent is we like models, we like abstractions. We technical folks, we need to speak to the execs at the level where they need a simple view of what's going on. They need to feel comfortable and confident. And when you look at something like this diagram, it just makes sense. It's reductionist, sure, but it makes sense. So on the left-hand side, you've got services being provided from the bottom up, and you've got dependency requirements traveling down from the top down on the right. Often those dependency requirements are based on tickets. One of the flaws in this model is that often what happens is product requirements come in and they require work at each of these levels. So we go through large-scale planning operations where we look at what the product requirement is. We generate technical requirements for each of those layers. We generate the technical requirements for the application layer. The application folks then look at what they need, which dependencies they need. So they generate requirements at the orchestration level. They will then generate their requirements for the domain, and it goes down and down until you get to infrastructure. Now, of course, this is building the airplane while it's in the air. It's fitting the wings. It's doing all of this kind of stuff. So it's driven by estimates. Everybody is expected to be able to estimate how long things are going to take. We also have boundaries. We have hard boundaries often between these levels. So if the folks on the UI side or the application side actually don't need any of the orchestration domain or data, they just need infrastructure, it can be very difficult for them to figure out how to do that. If they do, that starts to mean that the architecture diagrams and designs that emerge don't map to this layered view. Another thing that happens here is, again, it drives dysfunctional relationships. Folks in the top layer simply cannot understand why their dependencies from the application layer aren't being met when they feel that they are small pieces of work that really shouldn't take that much time. And because of the siloed nature of these layers, it means that these dysfunctional relationships turn into dysfunctional ways of working, and everything slips, compromises are made, hacks come in, and things tend to fall apart. So I want to touch on that dysfunctional relationship thing. Team Topologies, one of the reasons that I really took to Team Topologies is it's heavily aligned with developing generative cultures, an enjoyable place to work, an enjoyable space. it's not a zero-sum game in Team Topologies thinking. Everybody can win. It's not that in order for the business to generate the value, they need to work the workers harder. That's just simply not true. And so psychological safety comes up. Psychological safety is something, it gets thrown around a lot. And so as an experiment, I threw a prompt into ChatGPT and I asked it to produce me an image that represented a psychologically safe environment. And that's the image that you see here. And superficially, this looks great. It's got these big windows, the light comes in, everybody's happy, everybody's talking with each other, communication seems good, everybody seems relaxed. Seems like this looks like a really, really safe place to exchange ideas, generate and create value. But when you start to look at it in a little bit more detail, what we have here is we have a lot of what look like 30-something white guys with beards. They're all wearing similar clothes, favoring those skinny jeans. And again, we have a bunch of pretty conventional looking white females. Again, all of them look to be in their sort of mid-30s. They're all smiling. What's conspicuously missing is anybody else. So when I talk about psychological safety, it means these things. Within your culture, within your organization, and within your teams, we need people to feel comfortable coming up with ideas. We need them to feel comfortable that they're not going to be shamed, that they're not going to be judged. We need them to feel comfortable that if they fail, they won't be penalized for it. And we need them to feel comfortable in their own bodies. And that means we need to drive a diverse workforce. We need to bring everybody in. We need to have people of all different shapes and sizes. We have to have people of all different persuasions. We need to make sure that our culture does not look like this. No matter how seductive it is to have this amazing looking environment here, we need to interrogate ourselves a little more deeply on what true psychological safety means. And the way we do that is we start with empathy. So we empathize with each other. And the kind of the anti-patterns I was talking about in the last slide, we need to make sure that those kind of dynamics do not grow. We need to make sure that we are fostering an environment and interaction modes and communication modes that drive empathy, where we can see each other as people. And language matters. So we need to stop using words like resources to refer to people. People are gloriously and beautifully unique. They should be celebrated for that. People are not fungible. Resources are fungible. People are not. And we need to develop people in the directions they want to develop. And it is not a zero-sum game. As I said earlier, the company, the organization will benefit from this generative culture and these diverse and psychologically safe teams. Let's talk about platforms for a minute. I really want to dive a little deeper on platforms. And this is another concept that often it is very difficult to move to in terms of our thinking. So in Team Topologies, we employ a product thinking for platforms approach. What this means is platforms choose to harvest a service. The platform team makes the choice. They have the decision on what they implement. They do not receive a ticket that tells them. They do not receive a requirement that tells them what they need to develop. They choose, they make the decision what they're going to work on, what services they are going to offer. And when you think in these terms, it starts to become more obvious why you need that collaborative interaction mode to start with, because they need to gather that intel. They can't do it in a vacuum. And so this product thinking for platforms, where they make the decisions on essentially the platform features that they are exposing and providing to consumers, they need to have that conversation. They need to go outside their own bounds and actually talk with the people who are going to be using their services. In terms of using the platform, streamline teams choose to use one or more platform services. They have that choice. They know what they need to be doing. The platforms are not mandated. And again, both of these things are very difficult for some organizations to move their mental model to, because usually what happens is a decision is made to either adopt a commercial platform or to invest in building a large-scale internal platform. And that investment needs to have a return on investment, so an ROI. That means they mandate, now we've done this thing, you all have to use it, which it's not the way product works. Successful products are not able to mandate to their user base, to their consumers, their customers. The times where that is true, where they basically have a captive market, they have disgruntled customers who do not like what they're doing, and that leaves them ripe for disruption. So functional product organizations don't work in this way. And we need to switch that thinking so that these platform teams have the autonomy to figure out what they're going to do. The other thing is going back to thinnest viable platform. If the platform team is choosing to expose some services to work on some features that they want to provide to consumers, then they want to be able to fail fast. They want to be able to experiment. They want to be able to move forward quickly. So the thinnest viable platform supports that. What's the least effort they need to do in order to learn what is going to be valuable to essentially their customer base, which is going to be internal. In this case, it's going to be streamlined teams or other platform teams. One of the ways that we can kind of explain it is if you are using an external platform, if you are using AWS, for example, and you need a service that they do not yet provide, do you provide them with a requirement? Do you tell them that you need them to produce this service and you need a date for it and you're not going to move forward until they provide that? I'm not sure if anybody's tried it. I guess you could. My suspicion is you're not going to get much out of AWS by operating that way. So in that case, what do? You figure out the problem yourself. You use the AWS services that they have, and you build an architecture that allows you to create the value you're looking to create, but without having AWS as a bottleneck. And in fact, I have a real life example of that. Many years ago, now I was working on a cloud platform for a company that was producing a line of connected products. It was the first connected products that they had produced. They were spectacular design and engineering folks, but they'd never produced a connected product before. So they came to us and asked that we produce the platform for them. Now, for various reasons, we needed to use MQTT as a protocol, as a messaging protocol, and AWS did not have a product as a service yet that could use MQTT. We had a pretty good relationship with AWS, and so we were talking about this. They said, we're introducing it, and it's going to be in beta test soon. They said, if you want to, if you can wait, we can get your customer in on the beta test. And did we want to go back to the customer? We were talking about this with the customers, but did we want to recommend that, yeah, let's hold fire on this. Let's push your release dates to your product. Let's wait and we'll wait and see what AWS comes up with. No. So what we ended up doing was we built our own cluster of RabbitMQ instances, leveraging MQTT, and we hosted it in AWS and we managed it ourselves. And it was a fantastic solution. It worked extremely well and it ticked all of the boxes and we did not have to wait. So bringing that back to Team Topologies, you can employ this thinking in order to move your mental model from the traditional through to this more product-based thinking for platforms, and think about your streamline team. So if there isn't the service available, what do they want to do? Do they want to just down tools and wait until some dependency may or may not come along in a timescale that may or not be met? Or do they just want to figure out the way that they can create the value? And that, I think, is a really good way to think about this. We've talked in the abstract here. So I want to get into an actual case study here. And there are some very interesting things about this case study. So the case study is Improbable. Improbable essentially is a gaming company, and this is based in the UK. And it merged with a Swiss video game company, Zeus, who they were in the gaming industry as well, doing managed hosting. So they merged. There was this geographical split between the UK and Switzerland. And so they decided initially that they were going to design the architecture based on that geographical split. So we would have Zeus doing the Improbable multiplayer services, and then you would have, they had many other game studios, but we're just looking at these two for the moment. So they would have standard session-based games, complex game studios. You've got the X as a service, communication path built in there for both. So you can see this is very closely aligned to that traditional socio-technical architecture in one of the previous slides. So it is a Team Topologies start, but it's also the flow of value here is not quite as clear. And there's some obvious kind of, as we'll see, some obvious challenges to adopting this kind of approach. So as with any Team Topologies initiatives, it's incremental, it's emergent, it evolves. You can certainly, this is not about not knowing where you want to get to, but you certainly want to have a vision of what you're trying to achieve. And that vision should be based on value creation and outcomes. And you can also start to aspirationally start to put together what might the system look like. So this is not about not really thinking past the next sprint. This is about having that vision, but then understanding how you evolve through to that vision and being able to continuously adapt to what you're learning along the way. Now, instead of a single blue box at the bottom, we have the Improbable multiplayer services platform grouping. Now, one of the things, in fact, I'll go back to another conversation I had recently with a customer. And I was talking about the way that Team Topologies thinks about platforms and how platforms can spin up and have finished viable platforms. And they said to me, you've already talked to me about cognitive load. Isn't this going to actually increase extraneous cognitive load as there's an explosion of these platforms and everybody within the organization needs to now understand this ever expanding group of platforms, and they need to keep that in their mental model? And this is a great question. And the answer is no. The reason it's a no is what we have found is platform groupings are often fractal in nature. So if we look at this platform grouping here, Improbable looked inside, they took this fractal look, they zoomed in, and they realized what they had within this platform, this services platform, were some fairly distinct and cohesive groupings of features and functionalities. We have techniques to be able to identify this. We have fracture planing, for example. We have independent service heuristics. And these are techniques to take a look and see where it makes sense to actually carve off certain groupings of functionality, certain groups of service and value creation and acceleration, and identify that they might be a platform in their own right. And again, fracture planings can be technical. They can be domain-based. They can also be geographical. I'm sure many of you have worked on distributed teams where you have pretty serious time zone differences, but you have individuals on both sides of that time zone in the same notional team, within the same team boundary. Sometimes the fracture plane is there, it's geographical. So in this case, the fracture plane that we're looking at here are technical. And we can see that within that, once we zoom into that platform grouping here, we can see that there's a logical subplatform for orchestration. There's one for game infrastructure hosting, and there's one for improbable compute service. We also see there's still an internal platform at the bottom there. So that's the rest of the services that the platform grouping provides. So initially, you can see that we have a bunch of these collaborative interaction modes going on. So we can see that within that platform grouping, these nascent sub-platforms are doing a lot of communication between each other as they figure out where's the value, what's the minimum I can produce here to accelerate the rest of these platforms. And we can also see that immediately we've got orchestration and game infrastructure hosting are immediately useful to the streamlined teams. So there's collaboration going on outside there as well. We can also see that Kubernetes is needed for orchestration and the improbable compute service. So what's happening here is there's an enabling team with Kubernetes expertise. And instead of going in and actually doing the work for them and jumping out, what's happening here, you can see that there is the facilitating interaction mode there with the orchestration team and the improbable compute service team. So what they are doing is they are mentoring, they are growing those capabilities within those teams, and they are helping them get up to speed. So that's going to be a relatively temporary thing, just like those collaborative interaction modes that we can see elsewhere. As with all of these diagrams, you can see at the bottom, flow of value is left to right here. So now we're zooming in to, you'll see at the bottom, we've got the internal platform there. So we're zooming into the improbable multiplayer services platform grouping because we're going to get more fractal now. So we have the orchestration, the game infrastructure hosting, and the improbable compute service there. Now within the internal platform, we're zooming in further, and this is the fractal nature. And what Improbable realized is there's an opportunity to carve off an observability platform and an IAM, identity and access management platform here. So we see those platforms start to be formed. And again, you can see those collaboration, the collaborative interaction model happening there. We can also see that observability is a little more mature there. So observability is now actually operating as X as a service, has that communication, that interaction mode happening across the orchestration, game infrastructure hosting, and improbable compute service. So we can see this evolution starting to happen. We can also see that the improbable compute service is maturing. They've done the collaboration. They understand how to provide accelerated value to the consumers. So now that collaboration mode is disappearing and it is evolved into an X as a service mode. So we can see that this is starting to generate some real value here. And this is the evolutionary mode that we're seeing, and it is emergent. So without that fractal view, diving in even further to the internal platform, this is not something that Improbable would have been able to design up front. They simply wouldn't have had the understanding. They wouldn't have had the knowledge had they not gone to that first fractal level first and started working in that way. And then finally, we're going to zoom out again here. So now we have everything functioning like a well-oiled machine. So we have the clear communication paths between the internal platform and the other sub-platforms there. And of course, we've zoomed out, so we no longer see those sub-platforms, those fractal platforms within the internal platform. And everybody is operating X as a service, and value is streaming through left to right as each of these streamline teams and platform teams is experiencing acceleration based on the services they're receiving. Now, going back to continuous improvement, continuously adapting, is this the end state? It's never the end state. What's likely to happen is one of these platforms is going to find some services that they feel are going to accelerate their consumers even more. So at that point, they would then move to a short-lived collaboration interaction mode so they can start discussing and finding out from their consumers what's going to be valuable. And then that will move through to X as a service as they develop as well. And going back to the original question about extraneous cognitive load, this fractal view of platform groupings means that instead of your diagrams getting ever more populated with boxes which represent platforms, you can provide the level of abstraction that's needed for the audience. So in this case, we don't need to know what's going on in that internal platform. And in fact, depending on what folks need to know, you can shrink this down even further. So it's all about that cognitive load. You need to avoid the extraneous cognitive load. So a large scale, absolutely complete diagram is often not needed. If all of the communication is going on within a certain platform grouping, then you don't need to expose that externally. And so this is how you avoid the extraneous cognitive load. So back to product thinking for a moment for platforms. And you may recall I said that a wiki page is not just a wiki page to be a thinnest viable platform. So if we think about how we develop products, we need to know our target market. We need to create demand. We need to experiment quickly. We need to gather data from those experiments. And then we need to create value iteratively and incrementally. So that means running these experiments quickly, running them again, taking the data, moving very quickly there, and then incrementally adding small amounts of value so that we can test them out. We can abandon them if we don't need them anymore. And then we can move through to the next phase, whatever that is. So these experiments I was talking about. So we've been taught that duplication is waste. Don't repeat yourself. If we're software engineers, it's been drummed into us. We need to dry everything up. So duplication is waste. But also, teams everywhere failing hard at navigating fast flow. Because if our outcome is fast flow, then does duplication really matter? Contentious question, I know. But here's the thing. In order to not duplicate, even as software engineers, we often do need to duplicate to start with. For example, I remember reading something by Martin Fowler at some point in the dim and distant past where he was talking about how it was an anti-pattern to design frameworks. And instead, frameworks should emerge from duplicated effort. So if you find yourself doing something for the third time in the same way, then that is perhaps a candidate for something that might be useful in an emerging framework. That's exactly the kind of approach that Team Topologies supports and is very useful for us in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So what do I mean about duplication? Each of these experiments is a bet, essentially. We are betting that what we're producing, the problem we're solving, is a problem that needs to be solved, and what we are producing in order to solve that problem, the solution of the problem, is going to be the right solution. So if we are betting on that, another common anti-pattern that I see often within organizations is we want to solve problem X, with the response being, team Y over there is solving problem X. So why don't you wait for them to get finished? Because if you can just hang on, they'll get it solved. And then, of course, you've got a block dependency there because the solution isn't forthcoming in that moment. Perhaps it never will be. Perhaps when it comes out, it solves the problem from a certain perspective, but your perspective is different. So at this point, you get back into ticket and dependency hell, where you start then providing requirements to the team that's producing that solution. Those requirements then go into a queue. The team that is delivering those requirements is then trying to produce some sort of Swiss Army knife service, and everything goes to pot. So what we can do is we can actually tolerate different teams working on the same problem. And one thing we can do in order to support that is we can spin up an enabling team. So if we have active knowledge diffusion across our organization, we'll know that there are certain teams that are approaching similar problems. I think one thing you don't want is 3 teams approaching the same problem in the same way, because then it becomes a race for implementation. And in that case, there may be a question. If it is a well-known problem you've got to solve, we shouldn't necessarily be racing forward on the same thing. However, if there are problems where there are different perspectives, then working on those at the same time in different teams, that can work really well. And then, of course, we can spin up that enabling team who can then coordinate coaching and mentoring across the 3 teams that we have here, and they can figure out how to facilitate success in all 3 teams. So one of the critical principles here is that ending an experiment early is a success if it's based on data and learning. That is not a failure. So Team C here has not failed because the experiment was ended early. We have gathered enough data and learning from that experiment that we know that's not going to be the optimal outcome. So we can end that early, fail fast, and we can move along with the experiment still running on streamlined teams A and B. This goes back to psychological safety. You have to have a culture where people feel okay to fail. The other thing we need to do is we need to remove ego from this process. People can get competitive. People can want to own things. They can want to own systems. They can want to own teams. This ego-based ownership of things within an organization, that's something that we need to really keep an eye on and eliminate. Because when ego comes into play, this is the time where we start to move away from value creation as a desired outcome, and it starts to become incentivized towards individuals, and that's not aligned with the organization. This also applies to the platform team structure that I was talking about earlier on. Ego can come into play there. You can have territorial leaders who feel that their organization, certain things should be within their organization or at the team level. You can have leaders where that ego comes into play. This should be something that I own. And this is something that we really need to foster a generative and a safe culture where people are okay. They work towards the common goal. And they may feel it may not just be ego. It may be the case that you have a streamlined team and they are super, super enthusiastic about working on a specific technical problem because they feel that it is something really interesting for them to work on and they would really enjoy doing it. And so because that is taken on by a platform team, they may feel that their lives just got a little bit worse, that they've had something taken away from them. So again, this shouldn't be about ownership. There should be the ability to provide engaging work for individuals on the teams. And one of the things you can do here is you can develop structures within your organization to allow you to understand what it is exactly that the people on your teams want. And you have to be a little careful with this because they won't always tell you what they want if they don't feel psychologically safe. So I've had conversations before with individuals and I've asked them, what do you want to develop in your career? Oh, I want to learn Sitecore, CMS, and I want to learn more about front-end work and like all of this kind of stuff. And it just throws up a little bit of a flag for me because coincidentally, that's exactly what they need to be doing on the team they're working on at the moment. And so I've worked in leadership positions. I worked very hard to establish trust within my organizations. And trust means you have to show as well as tell. You have to demonstrate that trust as a leader. You have to do things. You have to put yourself out there a little bit and you have to deliver on things that might be a little tough for you to deliver on. You need to be able to have difficult conversations up front and then look at ways that you can establish goals for individuals to get them where they need to be. Many people optimize for that short-term dopamine hit of being able to say, yeah, sure, we can get you a promotion, knowing full well that there are barriers to that happening. So the person on your team goes away and they feel great about the conversation, then the promotion doesn't happen. And guess what? You just lost trust. So developing that trust and then listening to the folks on your teams and asking them and probing a little bit about what they want to do with their careers, what they want to do in terms of professional development. And it's super interesting because sometimes you get down to things and they have aspirations they've never talked about, which would actually be amazing capabilities to have within your teams. They want to experiment. They want to try things out. They want to learn new technologies. This kind of stuff, this is what you want on your teams. And it goes back to cognitive load. Optimize for that germane cognitive load and make sure that you are supporting your folks, align them with the technology And then going back to this idea of feeling loss because you have some interesting work taken away from you, make sure that you are looking at the work in a way where you can provide interesting technical problems to the people who want to solve them. And guess what? The people who want to solve interesting technical problems, they are the people that are going to create the most value within your teams. I'm approaching the end here. I want to go through a quick recap first. So what do I want you to take away from this? So the first thing, as I said before, if you take nothing else away from this session, cognitive load theory. And just to recap on that, extraneous cognitive load is all of those tortuous processes, those mental models that's very difficult to hold in your head at any one time. Just look around you. It doesn't matter what level you're at. If you're at this C-suite level, look at your organization and see what's causing friction and drag. If you're a software engineer working on a team, look around you and see what is it. You don't have to tolerate these things. Automate things. If you have a tortuous, error-prone process, automate it. If you have a process with lots of handoffs, look for ways that you can reduce those handoffs. Reduce that extraneous cognitive load. Free your mind up. Intrinsic cognitive load. As a software engineer, be aware of this. Imposter syndrome creeps in. If you feel that you don't have the same level of skill or experience in a particular technology as those around you, you're not dumb, you're not stupid. It is not you. It is that you have not been given the professional development support and resources that you need in order to gain these skills and experience. So look at what you can do. See if there are programs at the organization that you're working with. You often find there are training budgets there. So just ask. The worst they can say is no. And then there are also lots and lots of free resources out there, video classes online, that kind of thing. Upskill yourself. You are perfectly capable of this. You can bring up your skills one way or another and reduce that intrinsic cognitive load so you're not having to think too much about what you're doing in the moment. And then just optimize for that beautiful germane cognitive load where you're now free to be creative, to learn the domain within which you're working. And once you understand the domain, it doesn't matter whether you're a software engineer or a QA analyst, QA automation, DevOps, it doesn't matter. Once you understand the domain of your organization, you can start to have impact outside your team. And you can have much more of an impact on the product if you really truly understand what's happening there. So recap on the 4 team types. We had stream-aligned teams, ownership of value end to end. So that's from idea all the way through to your release of software to the customer, and then operating that throughout its life cycle. We have platform groups. So those platform groups operate in much the same way. They have end-to-end value, but their customer is internal. So their job is to accelerate time to value for the streamlined teams. You have enabling teams. So their job is to centralize skills and expertise and support the platform and the streamlined teams. So support them in building the capabilities and the skills internally so that they can operate more effectively, generate more value. You have complicated subsystem teams. So that is for areas where often technical systems, where it's very complicated, very complex, and there isn't much widespread knowledge across the organization. Then we have the 3 interaction modes. So we have collaborative, short-lived, very intense, often for those points where you're actually starting to think about what your thinnest viable platform is, and you will be talking to your consumers. You may have it between 2 streamlined teams, actually, if they are working on similar problems. So these interaction modes, they can operate. They're not intrinsically linked to specific team types. So you're not limited by that. And then you have facilitating, we have collaborating, and we have X as a service. So the facilitating is basically coaching and mentoring. And then we have X as a service. X as a service is always preceded by collaboration. You never go straight to X as a service. And X as a service is when you've reached a level of maturity in that communication where it's now much more structured. And so you probably have well-formed APIs that you're providing, and you're now able to communicate in a much more of a transactional way. Product thinking for platforms. So again, one of the things you want to do here is you want to promote it internally. You need to find your market, understand your market. You need to be able to promote it. Going back to that wiki page, you need to promote it. You need to instrument it with analytics so you can figure out what people are finding useful. You need to go take it to your market exactly as you would with a product, and then develop incrementally and adding value every time. And finally, that culture of continuous improvement. Make sure that you are moving towards a generative culture within your organization, and that you are never looking to a done end state. You are always looking to increase that or optimize for that time to value, looking for ways to do that, understanding of value and how you are delivering it. So I want to thank you all for attending. So at Conflux, we have a free benchmark tool, and that benchmark tool assesses you across 9 different principles. It's free. The QR code is there on the right and the link is below it. So you can just go there online and you can rate yourself and you can get a rating. It's super, super useful so that you can understand if you're thinking about, or if you're interested in team topology approaches, you can very quickly get an idea of where you stand at the moment. And this isn't a judgmental thing. It's not to say that you need to be at a certain point, but looking at going back to what I was saying about team topologies being a toolbox, patterns and practices, how you would structure that start to your journey can be really well informed by performing the benchmark test, understanding where you sit right now, where to focus on. I would also say that if you are interested in talking further commercially, so get in touch. We've got inquiries at confluxhq.com at the bottom there. That is the email address that comes through to all inquiries. You are welcome to email me directly at christopher@confluxhq.com. Absolutely happy to have a 30-minute call, no charge, and discuss what your problems are and what solutions might be. And we have a structured move forward from there without any front commitments. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you haven't already. So I'm at linkedin.com/in/CJ Marsh. We do have a little bit of time left. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to put them in post a comment there on the right or a question. So I'll wait to see if any of those come in. Thanks, Rosie. And thank you, Carsten. Good to see you here. Yes, Todd, can I briefly explain germane cognitive load once again? Yeah, absolutely. If we take extraneous as being all that stuff that we need to eliminate, if we take intrinsic being something like how much experience you have with a particular programming language, the rest of it is things like domain knowledge. Let's take a product engineering team. You have software engineers. There's an anti-pattern where software engineers are just delivery agents. They're downstream service providers for product. Now, if you start to engage them more, if you have a streamlined team where product is actually in that team, there's a tight feedback loop, you can get to a point where your requirements are going to become intuitive. So if, for example, the requirements don't actually need to be as detailed because the software engineers understand the product, they understand the market, they understand the domain in which the organization is operating, that allows them to focus a lot of their load on the thinking around that. So they can provide feedback to product, and it's a really tight feedback loop because they're in the same team. But it's that creative thinking. It's stepping outside. How do I get through this process? What's the syntax for this thing that I'm trying to achieve with my programming? Stepping outside of that and thinking about, does this make sense from a product perspective, what I'm doing? It allows them to flex that muscle. And one of the consistent complaints I hear from, or observations I hear from software engineers is, got so much knowledge here, nobody's listening. I could add so much more value than simply delivering code. So germane is that domain thinking. That's part of it. The other thing, Todd, is it's also creative thinking around what they're doing. So if you're focusing all of your cognitive load capacity on trying to figure out the process and trying to figure out the syntax, you're not really thinking about creative technical approaches. If you have a lot of headspace to think about that, you might find the software engineers can really start thinking about things like, is this the right architecture? And instead of thinking about how do I create all this code, they start thinking about what if I could reduce the amount of code I've got? What if there was more of an efficient way to do this? What if I could reduce the technical debt over here? What if I could improve performance? Now, these are all the creative thinking things. And if you have a cognitive load cap, but you're thinking about how do I use this programming language? How do I make it through this process? There is nothing left over. So germane cognitive load is all that stuff. So when I say creative, it's not just the creative juices are flowing. Creative technical solutions, future thinking, understanding that something's coming down the pipe later on and you understand what it is, and being able to have that headspace to think, wait, I know this is coming down the pipe here. I have a solution that's going to work now and also work for this future stuff. Is going to help us there. That's really what I think about in terms of germane cognitive load. I hope that helps. And if it doesn't, Todd, post another question. I can elaborate. Okay, thank you all for the kind comments that many of you have put up for me. I really appreciate them. I really do hope this has been useful for you. And if you've got any follow-up questions or you want to get into a conversation or LinkedIn or email, like I say, please do feel free to get in touch.